Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, and today I am on the Plug-in Lines channel once again, where we are taking a deep dive into tube Vari-Mu compressors. This type of compressor can give you really smooth, fat, full-bodied sounding compression that you can hear in audio examples like these.
But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound.
What makes Vari-Mu compressors, also known as variable bias compressors, so special is that the tubes inside of them are actually handling the compression. This is different than most other types of compressors you'll find that have tubes in them. These Vari-Mu compressors were among the earliest ever designed, but they're also still among the most coveted to this day. Probably the most iconic old-school Vari-Mu compressor ever designed was the Fairchild compressor, and these were favorites for decades on things like mix bus, vocals. A lot of people also like them on bass, acoustic guitars, pianos, you name it. And the special characteristic of a Vari-Mu compressor is that they'll often have a relatively fast attack time, but with a relatively softer knee. This combination of a faster attack with a softer knee gives you a great blend of compression that gives you the dynamic control you want, but without clamping down too hard or too aggressively on some of those early transients. But one of the other things that makes this type of compressor special is where you find a tube design, you often find a transformer. And transformers in audio gear often are a big component in giving you some extra tone and some extra girth. Tube gear is often associated with having extra character, but in many cases, a lot of that character comes from not just the tubes themselves, but also from the transformers that are in the design. The importance of the tone of a transformer in a Vari-Mu design is indicated by the name of the SPL IRON, one of the two Vari-Mu type of compressors in the Plug-in Lines Mega Subscription Bundle. That very name, IRON, speaks to the transformers inside this Vari-Mu design from SPL and Brainworks. It takes some cues from the original Fairchild compressors, but goes even further. There's a lot more flexibility here in things like attack and release settings, tube bias sidechain, and a whole lot more that we'll go into in just a few minutes. This compressor can actually be even cleaner, smoother, and more useful in more places than an original Fairchild compressor. And if you want to go even dirtier with it, you can do that too, with special thanks to this headroom control added by Brainworks. But for when you want a ton of tube and transformer character out of your Vari-Mu compressor, the NEOLD V76U73 compressor is absolutely one to check out. This design is based on the original Telefunken tube consoles. It has a preamp stage built into it, where you can add even more gain and character, and a little bit of some retro-style EQ filters. But the heart of this unit is the U73B. It can really make things sound fat and full and smooth all at the same time, with a little bit of potential for extra saturation and grit that can really help bring elements forward in the mix without them ever sounding strident. These are two really fun compressors to use. They've got so many possible applications. Let's dive into them, first figure out how they work, and then get our ears on them together and put them through their paces on a variety of instruments. Of course, the best way to hear these is not just by me playing around with them, but by you playing around with them for yourself. And if you want to do that, just go over to plugin-alliance.com, where you can try out these or any of the other compressors they make for free for 2 weeks. But to give you some direction in trying them out for yourself, let's go through the controls on these and then hear them in action. Of this pair of Vari-Mu compressors, the SPL IRON has the potential to be the more transparent of the two. This is absolutely a mastering grade compressor, and one of the ideal applications for it is mix bus. If you put it into its factory default settings, it sounds great on mix bus right out of the gate. You don't have to fuss around with it much at all. But there's a lot of flexibility here, and I'd say it's actually a lot easier to use than a lot of the original Vari-Mu compressors. This one does have a really variable attack and release setting that goes from fast to medium fast all the way up to really slow, and the same is available on the release times as well. You won't find numbers in milliseconds on these attack and release styles because they're slightly dependent on the different rectifiers that you can choose for this tube circuit. You can choose between germanium, LED, silicon, and germanium silicon, and each of these rectifier settings has its own unique balance of attack and release times. Some of the differences can be fairly subtle at the same settings, and some of them can be pretty significant. Some of the slowest attack and release settings are available in this LED setting, where some of the fastest attack and release settings are available over here in GE/SI, or germanium silicon. In the original manual for this unit, you can find the specific attack and release times spelled out, but honestly, my favorite way to use this is just by ear. I dial in an attack and release setting that seem to work for me, and then I'll just flip through each of the rectifier settings until the compressor really clicks for me in sound. As you use it more and more, you'll start to develop a sense memory for the difference between each of these rectifier settings, but honestly, if you only ever use it in its basic default silicon mode, it sounds pretty darn good right there. To set how much compression you're getting, you have this big threshold knob right in the middle, but you can also drive it even harder by turning up the input. Just be aware that you're only applying extra input if you take this switch down here and put it into plus mode. In plus mode, we're boosting anywhere from 2 dB to 12 dB, and in minus mode, we're reducing the input gain by anywhere from 2 dB to 12 dB. Same exact idea over here in the output section. Although it is based on tube and transformer gear, it is super high-end tube and transformer-based gear with 120-volt operation, so it can actually have really high headroom. So if you want to start getting additional grit and saturation out of this thing, jacking up the input and potentially turning down the headroom control here on the bottom can get you a lot more saturation. But if you want it to be a lot more transparent and smooth, it does that exceptionally well too. Couple more interesting controls here. You have this sidechain EQ section. You can put it in external to set your own custom sidechain EQ or key input. But it also has some really handy EQ presets in the sidechain section. In the off setting, the sidechain is actually filtering out frequencies below 20 Hz. And then in EQ settings 1, 2, 3, and 4, there are presets that emphasize or de-emphasize different parts of the mid-range and frequency spectrum. Each of these can make the compressor respond in a significantly different way to the program material you feed into it. So I definitely recommend playing around with this control and even consulting the manual so you can see what these frequency curves look like. But again, the best way to play around with it is just by listening. Click through these while the compressor is doing some significant compression, and you'll hear it react more and less to different elements in your mix. One more fun control in this compressor is this EQ option. If you flip the switch up to air bass, you get a little bit of a gentle lift in the lows and highs. It does a little bit of a low boost below 200 and 100 Hz and a little bit of a high boost as well, particularly above 5K and 10K. If you switch it to tape roll-off, there's going to be a subtle softening of the high frequencies. It's a fairly slow sloping filter, so don't be afraid to use this one if you just want a little bit more smoothness in the top end. Finally, at the bottom, there are the extra controls that BrainWorks throws onto so many of their plugins, including the TMT section, the ability to put it into a mid-side mode, the headroom control that can make this unit even dirtier or even cleaner, a high-pass sidechain filter to keep low frequencies out of the compressor's detector circuit, and for mastering applications, the mono maker for centering low frequencies and the stereo width control for adding a little bit of extra spread to the sides. And of course, if you want to go ahead and dial in too much compression and then back off just a little bit, there's the parallel mix control as well. This compressor really excels on anything where you'd want Vari-Mu style compression, but you wanted the option for it to be a bit more transparent, or where maybe a traditional old school Vari-Mu compressor just can't get you the right sweet spot in attack and release settings. While not an exact recreation of any earlier Vari-Mu tube design, this one really fills the same role as the highest-end Vari-Mu tube compressors ever made, with additional flexibility and, when you want it, additional transparency, with the option to drive it really hard for some additional color. But when you really want some additional color, one of my favorite compressors in the whole Plugin Alliance Mega Subscription Bundle has to be this V76U73. One of my favorite things about it is in the preamp section here, if you turn up the gain, you get a little bit of additional saturation and color, but without actually boosting level. You automatically compensate for your increase in input with a commensurate decrease in output. So you're just getting the additional color without the additional level. However, boosting this gain knob does drive our compression section even harder. In this preamp section, by default, there's a little bit of a low frequency roll-off and a high frequency roll-off that's extremely pleasing. While this might not be the first thing you'd grab for mix bus application, on so many elements that don't need extreme lows and extreme highs, just running through this unit can make them feel a little bit more focused. However, if you want to get rid of any of that low and high frequency roll-off that is inherent in this unit, you can hit this linear button, which totally removes the emulation of the natural EQ curves built into these old tube units. Or you could go even more extreme with it. There's a high frequency roll-off filter here that allows you to gently roll off frequencies above 3K, as well as a high pass or low cut filter. These can be really useful when you want to do really heavy-handed amounts of compression with the U73 part of this circuit. You've got two modes here, compress and limit. And you have a somewhat variable release and attack control. In its default 1.2 second setting, it is a really smooth and transparent sounding compressor, but you can go faster and faster and get some real grit and aggression out of it in this 0.3 second mode. In red, you'll see additional numbers added here that were not on the original unit. Same is happening in the attack section. There's both a fast setting and an auto attack setting, which is a little bit more program dependent and can let a little bit more transient through for a little bit more of a punchy sound instead of a smoothing sound like you get in the fast attack setting. This filter button will turn on and off a high pass filter at 100 Hz in the compressor's detection circuit, so you're not overloading the compressor's detection circuit with low frequencies, and this stereo button can take it in and out of dual mono and stereo modes of operation. On the far right, you can turn it on and off, change your meter settings, adjust makeup gain and a fine trim control here, as well as your mix knob. No matter how you set it, this compressor and saturator has the potential to have a lot of character. Even just passing signal through it without touching a single dial, things just seem to get a little fatter, a little richer, a little silkier. And when you push it into really extreme compression, you can get really smoothing, fattening kinds of compression out of this fast attack mode and really punchy present compression with the auto attack setting. For release, things can sound really smooth and transparent in some of the medium and slower settings like 1.2, and if you take it all the way to its fastest settings like 0.3, it can get really aggressive and explosive and almost slightly trashy in an absolutely gorgeous kind of way. This one I'd be less inclined to reach for on things like mixbus or mastering applications unless I was going for a really kind of old school feel with a little bit of extra flavor, but on individual elements, it can be absolutely gorgeous. You've got to try this one on vocals, where it can really make things full-bodied and smooth with just the right amount of grit, edge, saturation, and hair. You can use it on things like acoustic guitars or synths, things like overcompressed character pianos, and also some roundness and girth and tonal reshaping on things like bass and electric guitars. Absolutely a lot of fun to use. You can use Vari-Mu compression in any style and in any genre, but with that said, one of my favorite applications for Vari-Mu compression, especially when it comes to individual instruments, is on those kinds of tracks where there's a bit more space, where you have the room to make each individual element a little bit bigger, a little bit thicker, a little bit richer sounding. So I've picked a slightly slower tempo song here with a lot of organic acoustic instruments in it. This one is called Jackson. It's once again by the artist Taylor Bloom, produced by Josh Lee Turner, some great mastering clients of mine, and they sent me these multi-tracks originally so I could use them in my compression course, Compression Breakthroughs, but they were too good not to share here as well. Some absolutely beautiful songs and performances here, and we'll link to them in the description down below. You can absolutely use these types of compressors in more process genres and in more aggressive styles. But with that said, because I really like them, we can get sounds to take up a lot of space, I'd be more likely to reach for a Vari-Mu compressor on something like a Billie Eilish track than I would be on something like a speed metal track. With that note out of the way, let's dive right in and start hearing these on one of the best applications for Vari-Mu compressors, lead vocals. I've got 3 versions of the lead vocal track pulled up here. One just totally naked by itself. There's just a tiny bit of reverb that's being sent out to. And then the next one has the SPL IRON on it. And then the third one here has the NEOLD V76U73. Let me know if you can hear the same kinds of things I am. With the SPL, things just start to sound a little glossier to me, a little smoother, a little richer. And then with the V76U73, things start to get a little bit more focused, a little bit more forward, and perhaps get a little bit more subtle grit and hair in them in a really nice way. Let's go through each of them here in the last chorus, just on the vocals. Here we go.
But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound.
Cool. I think you can hear some of those differences there. On each one of these, I'm applying a pretty significant amount of compression. But with the SPL, it just gets bigger sounding to me, richer sounding, fuller sounding, but still with more clarity and detail. Even when we're level matching it, it just has, to me, a larger quality about it. And then when we go to the NEOLD, things get a little bit tighter, a little bit more focused, and there's a slightly more really endearing retro quality about it. We're getting a tiny bit of kind of buzziness and grit from the tubes and transformers modeled in this one. But if we wanted to, we could get even more extreme or even more subtle. Let's go and hear what that would sound like. Here in the A settings, I have it loaded up the way we just heard it. Over in the B settings, we have some even more extreme compression effects, with a little bit of the high cut and low cut filters applied for an even more retro tone. And in the C settings, I've done the exact opposite. We're barely compressing things at all, and hearing just a little bit of the tonal character that this kind of compressor might give when it's not doing any compressing at all. Here we go on the NEOLD, first in bypass.
But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. I'll never be late for the sky, but I can hold out if I try. I take it easy for a while, like good old, for good old Jackson Brown.
Sweet. We can also do something very similar with the SPL, hearing it with very little compression, as well as the significant amounts of compression that we heard just a little bit earlier. Let's do that comparison. In our A settings, we'll have significant amounts of compression, and in our C setting, we'll have very little compression and just the tone of the unit. Here we go.
But I wonder if I'll ever be like Jackson, if anyone will ever need my sound. I'll never be late for the sky, but I can hold out if I try. I take it easy for a while, like good old, for good old Jackson Brown.
Really beautiful quality to both of these compressors on his voice. Let's hear it on a couple of other elements. Another wonderful application for Vari-Mu compression, in my opinion, is on piano. And we can get pianos and keyboards to sound a little bit richer, a little bit bigger, a little bit more expansive and expensive with something like the SPL IRON, or we can do exactly the opposite and take them in a little bit more of a retro, grittier, somewhat more focused direction with a NEOLD. We'll be applying some pretty significant compression once again, and in this case, you'll get to hear the NEOLD with a couple of additional settings. In A, I'll have some pretty significant compression, and in B, we'll once again engage the high pass and the low pass filter. And although it might sound a little bit less big and expensive in the B settings, with these filters engaged, it's also going to sound even more focused in a way that could really work well in a dense mix. We want to hear the piano without it taking up too much space, particularly in the bottom. When there's a lot of elements going on in a mix, often you're going to want to cut significant amounts of lows out of the piano, and sometimes you don't need all the glossy highs either. And something like this NEOLD does that really focused, mid-rangey kind of piano absolutely beautifully. Let's hear these now. First in bypass. And now with the NEOLD. And now taking the NEOLD into its more extreme B settings. That just sounds like a kind of piano sound I've heard on so many records before. And if we were in a dense section where this piano is competing with other elements, this could totally work well for me, not just in spite of its mid-ranginess, but because of it. Let's do another example on some individual instruments here, this time acoustic guitars. And I really like Vari-Mu compression on acoustic guitars. It's not right for every track, but when it is, oh man, the character can be absolutely beautiful. Once again, I feel like we're going to get a slightly more polished and expensive sound out of the SPL and a slightly more gritty and rustic and classic sound out of the V76U73. And once again, I have an alternative sound loaded up here under the B settings on the NEOLD, where we're taking things a little bit more extreme and engaging the filters built into the preamp section. Let's hear these. Man, just so much richer and fuller and smoother sounding with this SPL IRON engaged. Now let's hear it with the V76U73. Man, just some beautiful focused fatness with that NEOLD. I almost feel like I stepped into a Nick Drake track all of a sudden. Really cool sounding. Brings some of the kind of woody earthiness out of this acoustic guitar sound that I'm absolutely loving. Let's take it to the next extreme now with these B settings. Man, that is super old school and gorgeous sounding to me. I don't have time to go through all the different types of audio examples we could do with Vari-Mu compression. We could easily use these things on hip-hop vocals, on some really haunting female vocals in an electronic kind of track. The V76U73 could be added to each and every single track on the entire mix, and maybe even the mix bus to give it a little bit more of a retro, old-school tube console kind of flavor. And the SPL IRON is absolutely gorgeous as a mix bus compressor and a mastering compressor. But rather than go through some more subtle settings, let's hear some extremes. Just so you can get a sense for the kinds of compression that these do when they're pushed hard, let's bring up a drum kit once more. Let's hear these going from subtle to extreme. I'll start in the A settings with the factory defaults on both of these, just a smidge of compression so you can get a little bit of a feel for their character when they're not driven very hard. Then we'll hear them in their B settings, where we're going to do more significant compression. And then we'll hear them in our C settings, where we can get really ridiculous amounts of compression. That would be awesome as a special effect or for blending a little bit in parallel. Then we'll play around with those settings a little bit more in D. Cool, some really rad sounds in there out of these compressors. Well, I hope you enjoy taking this detailed look at tube Vari-Mu compressors with me. Try them out for yourself over at plugin-alliance.com, where you can download these and use them for free for 2 weeks, along with anything else from Plugin Alliance. And if you've got yourself the Mega Subscription Bundle, these are just 2 more compressors that are part of that bundle at no additional charge. Once you get around to trying them out for yourself, I want to hear from you. What did you like these compressors the most on? What kinds of settings were you most likely to use them in? Let us know down in the comments below. I love to hear from you guys, and I read every single one of them. And remember, this is just one installment in a multi-part series on all of the compressors in the Plugin Alliance Mega Subscription Bundle. We have deep dives into VCA compressors, FET compressors, opto compressors, and even an overview of all of the main compressor types. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, this time on the Plugin Alliance channel. See you next time.